Crucifixion and burial. We have biblical and other literary evidence that suggests that the executed, including those who were crucified, were properly, but of course not honorably, buried. Now, this is obviously of great significance for understanding the crucifixion and burial of Jesus of Nazareth. And some have contended that perhaps Jesus and the other two men crucified with him would not have been buried, but as what is widely believed, the Roman custom would have been left hanging on their crosses, unburied, to decompose and be picked apart by animals. Or perhaps, at best, the bodies thrown into a shallow ditch or something like that, and perhaps devoured by dogs. I'm sure we all have heard about this theory that was circulated 16, 17 years ago. So this is why this question is important. Now, the literary evidence and the biblical evidence, so far as that evidence goes, is quite clear. Even the executed, even the crucified, were buried. And I'm going to review that evidence with you in just a moment. The archaeological evidence, however, is quite limited, and that's why I say in the second bullet it is less clear. However, there is some new evidence that's come to light, or soon will when it gets published, which I want to share with you. So some of what you're going to hear this morning, almost no one else has heard. It's unpublished material, and I and my students were given very privileged access to some of this evidence when we visited Tel Aviv University last June, and I will give credit where credit is due. So let's review what is known and then move on to review some of these new discoveries, which I think you'll find very exciting. Well, first of all, let's review the actual biblical evidence. And of course, we begin with Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23, and the question of post-mortem hanging. And this is the way it started, as far as we can tell, in the earliest biblical literature. And so this Mosaic law says, if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, you hang him on a tree. And so there is the language both in the Hebrew and in the Greek translation, usually referred to as the Septuagint. His body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you will bury him the same day. So that is the basic law. And the evidence suggests, evidence in Qumran, as well as in Philo and Josephus and other sources, the evidence suggests that this biblical law was the normal practice in Israel from Old Testament times right on into the time of Jesus and the early church. Look at this. Now, this is Joshua. And you can see how the law appears to be followed here, even though the king of Ai is considered an enemy. So Joshua defeats Ai, and then he hangs the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at the going down of the sun, Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and cast it at the entrance of the gate of the city and raised over it a great heap of stones. So his body has been buried, not with honor, rather dishonorably, but nonetheless, before the sun went down, his body is placed in the ground and is covered. And then we have a similar story later in Joshua chapter 10, the hanging of the 5 kings whom Joshua defeated. Afterward, Joshua smote them and put them to death, and he hung them on 5 trees, and they hung upon the trees until evening. At the time of the going down of the sun, Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and they set great stones against the mouth of the cave. Again, it's dishonorable burial. the way the language says, threw them into the cave and so on. There's no mourning, no lamentation, no ceremony of any sort. The bodies are simply thrown into the cave, and then they roll stones against the opening of the cave. And so you can see this Mosaic law so clearly articulated in Deuteronomy is being practiced in these episodes in Joshua in respect to enemies of Israel. So no honor, no pity, nothing like that. It's simply the body is to be buried before the sun goes down, so there is no curse upon the land. So it has more to do with the purity of the land, more to do with Israel's relationship to God than it has to do with pitying, although that does come up in later texts. It has little to do with pity for the family of the executed man or for the executed man himself. And that's very important to keep in mind as we look at other texts. Now, advancing in time to the very beginning of the first century, Philo, who, although he visited Israel, he lived most of the time next door in Egypt at Alexandria. He is complaining in this text about a Roman governor's cruelty and indifference to Jewish sensitivities. And so in this complaint, he says this, I have known instances before now of men who had been crucified, and I draw your attention to the verb he uses. This verb is not the verb that's used in the New Testament. You can see it's skolopizo, but it's the same as stauroo. Stauroo and skolopizo both mean to be staked, to be tied to or nailed to a stake, and that's where we get the word cross ultimately in the Roman style, with a cross piece usually, not always. So he says, I have known instances before now of men who had been crucified when this festival and holiday was at hand, being taken down and given up to their relations in order to receive the honors of sepulture and to enjoy such observances as are due to the dead. Isn't that interesting? Now, he's not talking about burial of people who were crucified in Israel, but rather in Egypt. So it's not the land of Israel. It's not the Holy Land. This is not where the law of Deuteronomy 21 applies. But out of respect for Jewish sensitivities, Roman governors would allow the executed to be taken down, especially if it's on the eve of a holiday. So make note of that too. You can see the relevance that has for understanding Jesus' crucifixion and how he and the two men crucified with him would have been taken down and buried on the very eve of Passover in Jerusalem. And so this is relevant for that. And so what Philo is complaining about is that this is not being observed. Let's go down a little further. We can pick it up right here at sentence 84. But this man, the governor, did not order men who had already perished on crosses. There we have the noun stauros in the plural form, who had perished on crosses to be taken down. But he commanded living men to be crucified, men to whom the very time itself gave, if not entire forgiveness, that is the holiday time, still at all events a brief and temporary respite from punishment. So he's outraged over this insensitivity of Flaccus, the Egyptian governor. He goes on to say that the spectacle of their sufferings was divided. For the first part of the exhibition lasted from morning to the third or fourth hour, in which the Jews were scourged, were hung up, and you can see the verbs again for scourging and the verb that's used in Deuteronomy and Joshua for being hung up or crucified, were tortured on the wheel, were condemned, and were dragged to execution through the middle of the orchestra. And then after this, people danced and so on, and he thought it was simply outrageous. Actually rather typical in some pagan settings, but from a Jewish point of view, outrageous. I find this very instructive that Philo would so complain about behavior outside of the land of Israel. See, you would expect this perhaps if this happened in Jerusalem, but this is not in Jerusalem, it's in Egypt, and I think that's a very important point. Now, let's go forward another generation to Josephus, who now is complaining about the behavior of the rebels during the Great Rebellion, 66 to 70, when the Jewish people, or at least some of the Jewish people, revolted from Roman rule. So he says this of the rebels: they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away there the priests that they had murdered, their dead bodies without burial, although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men, that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. So in this context of bitterly complaining of the behavior of the rebels with respect to the aristocratic priests that they had killed, Josephus, as an aside, mentions how the Jews are so concerned about burying people, even the executed, even the condemned and crucified. So this is no Christian apologetic that we're reading here. This is Josephus explaining the Jewish customs and practices during peacetime. And even during this rebellion, he expects that the rebels at least ought to show that kind of decency and respect toward the dead, but they did not. And if you read all of Josephus, you know that because of this crime and others, this is why the temple was condemned to the flames, as Josephus speaks. It had to be. God had no other choice but to purge with fire the holy precincts because they had been so defiled by this criminal activity, this shedding of blood, and the failure, in some cases, actually to bury the dead. Now, let's now step back in time to the 1st century BC and look at a very important Dead Sea Scroll. This is from Cave 11. You'll see there near the bottom in parentheses, 11Q Temple. And what we have at this point is a bit of a paraphrase of Deuteronomy 21, the very text that was quoted just a few minutes ago. But I want you to notice an interesting inversion or alteration in the sequence. If a man is a traitor against his people and gives them up to a foreign nation, so doing evil to his people, you are to hang him on a tree until dead. And I give you the Hebrew there just to note that it is the same language we have in Deuteronomy 21. You are to hang him on a tree until dead. Then let's skip down a little further. If a man is convicted of a capital crime and flees to the nations, cursing his people and the children of Israel, you are to hang him also upon a tree until dead. But it goes on to say that you shall not leave this body hanging on a tree overnight. You most certainly bury them that very day, because it otherwise brings a curse on the land. So it's very obvious that we have a reworking of Deuteronomy 21, but the sequence of dead, hang, and that's what you see here in the red, Deuteronomy 21's dead, hang sequence has been reversed. It's now hang and then dead. Is crucifixion in view? Because crucifixion normally didn't take a dead body and hang it on a tree or a cross, but rather a living, suffering person who is still alive, and that person then dies while hanging on the cross or the tree. And I think it is, in fact, crucifixion that's in view. So whereas Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23 speaks of one put to death and then hanged, 11Q, Qumran, cave number 11, the temple scroll, speaks of one hanged until dead. Most think that crucifixion is in view, as we also see in the Pesher, the commentary on the prophet Nahum, found in Qumran's fourth cave. Some of that reads, commenting on Nahum 2:12b, he fills his cave with prey, his den with game. This refers to the lion of wrath. And unfortunately, we have lost some text. With vengeance against the flattery seekers, whom he will hang up alive. And they will then become a curse, as it is with traitors. Alluding to Deuteronomy 21. For one hanged alive on a stake is called accursed of God. So this probably, we think, refers to King and High Priest Alexander Jannaeus, who in the 90s or somewhere in there, BC, crucified some 800 Pharisees. And Josephus tells us about that in Jewish Wars, Book 1, and also Antiquities, Book 13. Jannaeus' rage was grown so extravagant that his barbarity proceeded to a degree of impiety. For when he had ordered 800 to be hung on crosses in the midst of the city, and there he uses stauroo, that verb, anastauroo, which is what the New Testament uses, he had the throats of their wives and children cut before their eyes. And these executions he saw as he was drinking and lying down with his concubines. And Josephus, rightly in my view, sees this as outrageous behavior. And besides 11Q temple and 4Q Pesher on Nahum, we may in fact have a third Qumran text that refers to crucifixion. And I'm referring to 4Q 282I, as it's called in Joseph Fitzmyer's critical edition. Greg Dudna reads it and has reconstructed to read this way. The leaders astray something, by him when he was hung up, he will be called by them. And so I know that's not much to go on, but the language so agrees with Qumran's Deuteronomy 21 interpretation that we think this is referring to the same thing, the hanging of people alive until dead. And so we may then have three passages at Qumran that refers to Deuteronomy 21 relating to crucifixion. Now we want to say something else more from Josephus. He adds this. Now this is very important because you might say, oh, that's all well enough and good. That may be the law, that may be the understanding at Qumran. That doesn't necessarily mean it was the practice in the first century. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what Pontius Pilate observed. And so this is an important place from Josephus. Two passages, both of them in his Against Appian, a 2-volume work he wrote in the 90s AD to counter the anti-Semite Appian, who was slandering the Jewish people. Josephus says this in Book 2, our law has also taken care of the decent burial of the dead, but without any extravagant expenses for funerals, and without the erection of any illustrious monuments for them, but has ordered that their nearest relations should perform their rites, and has shown it to be regular that all who pass by when anyone is buried should accompany the funeral and join in the lamentation. He goes on to note, Romans do not compel those that are subject to them to transgress the laws of their countries. I think that's very important. And so, and even elsewhere, Josephus says that the Romans did not provoke the Jewish people by making them transgress their customs. So what we're left with is every reason to believe that Jewish sensitivities during peacetime, that's an important qualification, during peacetime, not the rebellion 66 to 70, but during peacetime, Jewish customs and sensitivities were respected by Roman authority. So summing up, the biblical requirement to bury the executed, such as Deuteronomy 21, was updated to take into consideration crucifixion. So you have people still living hung up until dead, rather than the reverse as in Deuteronomy. Philo and Josephus state that Roman authority respected Jewish burial traditions, which included the proper burial of the executed, even in Alexandria, Egypt. In a popular book, John Dominic Crossan expressed skepticism that Jesus was taken down from the cross and placed in a tomb. He argued this on the basis that there is very little evidence of the burial of victims of crucifixion. He says on page 188 of his book, Who Killed Jesus?, we have found only one skeleton and one nail. And that's what we can now challenge. He didn't know that there was other evidence. There actually was some evidence available then, but more has come to light since. So does archaeology support Dom's skepticism? Of course, his skepticism relates to the non-burial of Jesus. He believed that Jesus was either left on the cross, not buried at all, or perhaps at best was cast into a shallow ditch where dogs perhaps ate his body. Now, right away, by the way, I should tell you that many scholars objected to this when it was published in 1995, saying this is inconceivable, this is Jerusalem after all, just outside the walls of Jerusalem on the eve of a very holy holiday, Passover. It's inconceivable that these corpses would be left hanging on crosses, which would be extremely offensive to the religious sensibilities of the people of Israel, especially the many thousands thronging to Jerusalem for that holiday. But the idea of bodies being chewed up by dogs right outside the gates of Jerusalem at this time, I mean, if you know anything about Jewish sensitivities about the dead, you could understand how this is so improbable in the first instance. But we do have evidence that's quite relevant that suggests that that's not true. We actually have dozens, if not hundreds, of nails and more bones too. So it isn't true, it's factually inaccurate to say we have but one skeleton and one nail. There's actually a lot more. Hundreds of nails have been recovered from tombs and ossuaries. It has been suggested that they were used to scratch the names of the deceased on the ossuaries, or were used to seal the lids of the ossuaries, or whatever. But many of these nails are encrusted with human bone and calcium. Is this from a casual contact with bones, or is this from something more sinister? Ancient traditions tell us that crucifixion nails had protective powers, kind of like a lucky rabbit's foot, so that people wanted to be buried with them. Sometimes crucifixion nails were used in magic and incantations. And I've noticed this. I've worked with some texts, exorcism texts, healing texts, charms and incantations. And once in a while it'll say, it's necessary for this charm to work that you obtain a nail used in crucifixion. And that's strange. So some think that that's why there were nails found in some ossuaries and in tombs, even of the upper class, the aristocrats. So let's then review the archaeology, old and new. This is the well-known heel of Yehohanan. This is Crossan's one nail and one skeleton that he's referring to in his book. And it's a nail, as you can see, still embedded in the right heel. There's the heel, the very end of the heel. And so you should imagine a person upside down. So it's as though we're looking at the bottom of the right foot of Yehohanan. And you can see the rusty iron spike piercing through the heel, and then it fish hooks here at the sharp end. And we think that's why it's still in his heel. That is, when he was taken down from the cross, the nail could not be extracted. And so then with an axe or a hatchet, the upright beam was chipped away until the wood itself gave way. And so Yehohanan was buried with the remains of what we might call a wood washer on this side of his foot, and then a chunk of wood that had been chopped out of the upright post of the cross, and wood traces actually still can be detected. Now, I have to disappoint you. When you go to the Israel Museum, what you see on display is not that actual bone with the nail in it. You see a plastic replica. This is the real thing, and we had the opportunity, my grad student who's here, Greg Monette, and another grad student, we had the actual opportunity or I guess it was just Greg and I, to actually hold that in the little padded box in our hands. That was wonderful to see it. Here's a chance where I'm actually, I was told that you can look at it all you want, just don't touch it. So there I am, I'm touching it with my eyes, as it were. And it was a rare opportunity, and I appreciate this very much. You can't just walk in and say, where's Yehohanan's heel? I want to see it. By the way, that was a big surprise to me too. Dr. Israel Hershkovitz, in his file, had the actual photograph that was taken of that heel and nail when it was first recovered from Yehohanan's ossuary. The ossuary was found in Jerusalem in 1968, and that's what it looked like. I did not know that, so when you see it here, it's the bone fragments that belong to the heel have been glued back into place, and so what it actually looked like was like that. So there's been a little bit of restoration in making it a little more obvious what it is. That's what they found. Well, crucifixion and nails, of course, go together. Writing in the 2nd century BC, Plautus refers to the crucifixion victim with his arms and legs double nailed. Plutarch, writing in the beginning of the 2nd century AD, asks, will you nail him to a cross or impale him on a stake? A 3rd century author described it this way, punished with limbs outstretched, they are fastened and nailed to the stake in the most bitter torment, evil food for birds of prey, and grim picking for dogs. And that's the way it was for those who were not buried. And that's what John Dominic Crossan had in mind when he suggested that perhaps Jesus was not properly buried and so was either left on the cross or thrown into a ditch where he could be eaten, his body could be eaten by dogs. There is Yehohanan's ossuary, and there's his name, Yehohanan, and then son, and then we have a word, Hakadol, or something like that, and no one has been able to figure out exactly what this word is. It could be a name, it could be some sort of epithet. Yigal Yadin suggested, I think it's implausible that this means Yehohanan, son of the one hanged with his knees apart. I don't think so, but it's very unclear. But that's the actual ossuary in which this skeleton with the spike in the right heel was found. It therefore may have looked something like this. I draw your attention here. So there's the washer through which the spike passed, through the heel, into the upright beam, and then the tip of the spike was fish-hooked, and that's what made it impossible to extract. And so this part of the wood was then chipped out. And apparently no problem with the left heel. Okay? Now, we don't think this is right, and Israel Hershkovitz emphasized that in our meeting with him in June, that this is fact, you'd almost have to take the shoulders out of joint to make this work. And so he probably had his arms out either this way or this way on top of the beam and nailed as well, and not simply tied. Okay, and we've actually measured the length of the skeleton. The man in our modern terms is 5 feet, 5 3/4 of an inch tall. That would be average or maybe slightly below average in this period of time. And in a part of the tomb complex was a woman who is 4 foot 10 1/2 inches. And again, about average or maybe slightly below average. So this gives us an idea, these two skeletons and many others, the size of the people then. And so for a man to be 5'6" or 5'7" and weigh 135, 140 pounds, that would be average. And for a woman to be 5 feet tall and weigh 90 or 95 pounds, that would be average. We would be considered very large people compared to the people 2,000 years ago in that part of the world. It also sheds some light on the Easter story, the women going to the tomb of Jesus, wondering who would help them move the stone. And so we should imagine 2 or 3 women, barely 5 feet tall, not even 100 pounds each, wondering if they could find a big strapping man at 5'6", 140 to help them move that stone. And a decapitated woman has also been found at Givat HaMivtar. Now, there is some question about the gender. Is it a woman or is it a man? But I still think it's interesting that a decapitated person would be buried. So we don't just have Yehohanan who was executed and then properly buried. We have this person as well. But let me say something about the second person here, the man at Mount Scopus, the remains of a man who had been decapitated. And here is some of the discussion of it, the bibliography. I'll pass over it, though I will say a little bit more about it in just a moment. Now, to go back to Mount Scopus, not Givat HaMivtar, but Mount Scopus. The tomb was excavated in 1979 by Gershon Edelstein of Israel's Department of Antiquities. Now, it's called the IAA, Israel Antiquities Authority. And I'm particularly interested in what Joe Zayas had to say about it. I know Joe, and I appreciate his work over the years. He's an anthropologist, not actually an archaeologist, but he's worked side by side with archaeologists for decades, and his specialty is examining the skeletal remains that are found in these tombs. So he's not an expert in ossuaries or archaeology, but he does know a lot about these ancient skeletons. He has seen hundreds of them and has written a number of studies relating to them. Now, this particular article to me is fascinating. Notice the title, Anthropological Evidence of Interpersonal Violence in 1st century A.D. Jerusalem. Interpersonal violence. Okay, well, here's what he's talking about. This is the elbow. This is at the tip, the distal end of the humerus bone of a woman buried in this tomb at Mount Scopus. And I know this is grisly, but the end of her elbow has been sheared off. And so the thought is that, it was a defensive move trying to block a sword or perhaps axe swung at her, and it actually takes the tip of her elbow off. Now, what Josias rightly determined was that there was no infection and no healing. Do you know what that means? Yeah, I can see you nodding your heads. Yeah, if there was no infection and no healing, it means she died. There was no opportunity for either healing or infection. Now, that would not have killed her, but it could be that there was another stroke of axe or sword that did kill her that left behind no obvious marks in the bones. Now, her neighbor in the same tomb complex has been, and I'm sorry the sun is shining through so much at the moment, and so it's hard to see it. So I think one of the marks you can see clearly, it's a slice that goes, see that right there and there? So there's a slice, that's one of the neck bones, a vertebra. And there's another, we can't see it, but a slice up here. So there were 2 strokes to take off the head of this individual. Now, Josias comments on that, and he says here in the second bullet, the man was decapitated by 2 strokes. Now, the skeletal evidence is very clear. So from this, Zayas concludes that it resulted from, quote, an act of violence, interpersonal violence, a domestic brawl, rather than a judicial execution. Well, the first time I read that, I was a little puzzled because one of my hobbies is, I like to read history. I really have fun, historical fiction and actual dull history and so on. And I had visited the Tower of London in the 1990s and did the Beefeater tour. How many of you have done that? You go to the Tower of London? Oh, good. 7 or 8 people. And they love to tell you about the execution of James, Duke of Monmouth in 1685, how many strokes it took to take his head off. So in remembering that, I thought, And so I spent months gathering information, some of it very obscure, in journals dealing with Roman time Britain and Roman executions and so on. Fascinating body of literature. Emailed some British scholars as well, and discovered that the norm was 2 strokes to take off a head in judicial executions. But I also learned that taking off a head in just battle, never mind brawling with your relatives at home, but an actual battle on the field of battle where people are swinging swords and jabbing with spears and bringing down axes, beheading is extremely rare. Now, we're used to Hollywood and movies and Conan the Barbarian, and heads are just popping off right and left. But that's not the way it was in real history. And so the idea that this man could be rolling around in a brawl and his sister-in-law loses the end of her elbow and he gets his head whacked off and it's all a fuss at home, I think is most unlikely. This is not interpersonal violence, at least not that part. I think it's better to think that either she was injured in some kind of a riot or perhaps injured by her relative and she dies from her injury and he is executed. And so I do, with respect, disagree with Joe on that. The 2 strokes that took off his head almost certainly was the result of a judicial beheading. And so that's what I say in this slide. Judicial beheadings usually required more than 1 stroke. 2 or 3 strokes for Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587. 5, in fact, we're not even sure. And I checked with the Beefeaters and they confirmed it. They don't know. It was 5 at least, perhaps as many as 7 or 8 strokes to take off the head of the Duke of Monmouth in 1685. The executioner, you might wonder, was intoxicated. His first swing buried the axe in the Duke's shoulder. He simply missed and planted the axe in his shoulder. The Duke was screaming, and he was tipsy, and he put his foot, and he got his axe out and took another swing. It took at least 5 to do the job. So anyway, there you have it. There are also ceremonial post-mortem decapitations as seen in a number of Roman-era burial sites. In these cases, almost always, there were 2 or more strokes. Beheadings in battle are rare. You get smashed skulls, pierced bodies, that sort of thing. That's the norm. Run through by sword or spear, or your head caved in by sword or axe. In fact, there's a recent excavation, or it's been a number of years now, the Battle of Toten in 1461. It was part of the War of the Roses, and several hundred skeletons were recovered, and there was only 1 decapitation. And the examiners of that particular skeleton are convinced that the decapitation was a post-mortem insult. It didn't, in fact, happen during the battle itself. Therefore, the man in Tomb D was probably executed by beheading. Perhaps, this is pure speculation, of course, perhaps for the murder of his relative in the adjacent Tomb C. So let's sum up thus far. The archaeological evidence supports the literary evidence. The executed were properly buried. Also, the best preserved tombs. This is a very important point to remember. The very best preserved tombs and skeletons are of the wealthy. What's the point of that? Well, the wealthy are the least likely to be crucified. I mean, if wealthy people committed crimes sometimes and committed serious crimes and sometimes were executed, but the wealthy usually were beheaded. Whereas it's the poor whose skeletons are the poorest preserved, if preserved at all, and they are the most likely to be crucified. So just the nature of things means that we shouldn't expect to find very much evidence, 2,000 years removed in time, very much evidence of crucifixion. The other point that should be made is that the bones that are going to give evidence of crucifixion are small bones. So it'd be the wrist or the phalanges or carpals, metacarpals, these small bones, and they are very poorly preserved. The bones, the longer bones, the skull, the rib cage, those are the bones. The hips, they're the ones that survive. But the small bones in the hands and in the feet are the least likely to survive in good enough conditions to exhibit evidence of crucifixion. And so that really complicates this kind of study. But do we have new evidence? We do. Now this is old evidence, but thrown recently into a new light. And I refer to the Abba tomb. We found in the Abba tomb, when it was discovered 40 years ago, just over, an inscription that reads in Paleo-Hebrew script this way: I am Abba, son of the priest Eleazar, son of Aaron the Great. I am Abba, the oppressed, the persecuted. I mean, poor guy. I mean, he's really down in things. Who was born in Jerusalem and went into exile in Babylonia. Now, hold on. We're not talking about the Babylonian exile of the 6th century. This is a 1st century BC inscription. And carried up for interment Mattithiah, son of Judah, and I buried him in the cave which I purchased by writ. Now, this is fascinating. Who is this Mattithiah, son of Judah? Here is there's the inscription. I have another picture that's better, but there it is above the niche in the Abba cave. And there is this beautiful ossuary. Notice it's not incised, the artwork, but excised. That is, the rosettes protrude instead of being incised inward. Beautiful example of an ossuary. There in color is this Paleo-Hebrew, and so most of us, especially Second Temple people, when we study Hebrew, we study the Herodian script, and so you look at that and you go, oh my goodness, we'd have to get out a guide to help us match the alphabet letters, and so we could figure out which words are which. So I am Abba, and on it goes. Here it is written out in a way that's a little easier for us to read. And so now you can see the Anna Abba, son of the priest Eleazar. Now notice the word breaks are rather interesting. So the first letter of Eleazar, and then we carry on. But the red letters point to the very interesting name. Interment for Mata, and of course here's the last letter of his name. So Mattithiah bar Yehuda. So who is this Mattithiah, son of Judah? That's the question. So here at the end of line 5, beginning of line 6, that's the name. Who is this person? Whose bones did Abba the priest bury? Who was this Mattithiah, son of Judah? And as I said, the words went in exile into Babylonia are not in reference to 586 BC, the end of the First Kingdom. It is a 1st century ossuary, tomb, and inscription. His skeletal remains, and here's where it gets so interesting, his skeletal remains indicate that he suffered beheading and crucifixion. Nails piercing the hands were found in the ossuary. The man apparently was both crucified and beheaded. Who was this? And here, I realize they can't be seen very well, but what these pictures show is that either a very heavy and sharp sword or perhaps an axe struck the back of the very top of the neck and actually scarred the base of the skull, the occipital, and in passing through the neck actually clipped the jawbone, the bottom of the mandible. So there's actual trauma marks of the beheading at the base of the skull and the base of the jaw, as well as actual nails, as I understand it, still embedded in the hands. Now, who is this? Well, here's a likely candidate. Let's think about it. According to Josephus, Antigonus, the last Hasmonean ruler, remember, with the help of the Parthians, he displaced Hyrcanus II and gained control over Israel. Then Mark Antony persuaded the Roman Senate to make Herod the king of the Jews, and then helped Herod with some Roman legions so that he could fight for his throne. And he did successfully, and in 37 BC defeated Antigonus. Now, according to Josephus, Antigonus was then beheaded. And that's why in one of my recent publications a few years ago, in talking about the crucified and whether they're buried, I didn't talk about Antigonus because he wasn't crucified, he was beheaded. And of course, we didn't know anything about him being buried either, so I passed over on this. Yes, I knew of Dio Cassius, who says Antigonus was crucified according to his Roman history, book 22. But I couldn't reconcile that, and Dio Cassius is writing sometime after Josephus, so I assume Josephus was in a better position to know what was going on. So who was correct? Well, maybe both are. The full name of Antigonus, by the way, was Mattathias Antigonus, son of Judah Aristobulus. So our Abba Cave inscription may well be referring to him. And according to Josephus, he was beheaded. According to Dio Cassius, he was crucified, and the skeleton in the Abba Cave was both crucified and beheaded. Now, you can read up on this. We were in on it before the article came out, but the article did come out in July, I believe, in the Israel Exploration Journal by Yoel Elitzer, the Abba Cave. Fascinating reading because there's a lot more to the story. Josephus says in Antiquities, book 15, he's quoting Strabo. Strabo of Cappadocia attests to what I have said when he thus speaks, quote, Antony ordered Antigonus the Jew to be brought to Antioch and there to be beheaded. And this Antony seems to me to have been the very first man who beheaded a king. That's an interesting comment. Cassius goes on to refer to him as having, as I already said, having been crucified. And I couldn't reconcile that until this more recent work on the Abba Cave. Now, let's talk about that and the mystery of Niku Has. Niku Has presented his interpretation of the Abba Cave inscription and skeletal and nail remains on Israeli television in December 1974. Initially skeptical, two archaeologists on the program became convinced that Has was correct. And Yoel Elitzer has obtained tapes of this program from 40 years ago and has reviewed them. And so he talks about that in his article that I just mentioned. However, weeks later, after the television program, in January 1975, I'm sorry about the typo. My computer, no doubt, was helping me get this correct. Haas was found in the street face down with a serious head injury. He remained in a coma for 13 years. The cause of his injury remains unknown even to this day. Isn't this strange? And so that, of course, brought, he was unable to publish. Well, months after Haas's injury, Patricia Smith was asked to publish Haas's notes and findings. Her study appeared in 1977. Here is the front page of it, The Human Skeletal Remains from the Abba Cave by Patricia Smith. It is now believed that she reported on the wrong box of bones. Now, I want to defend her. Can you imagine going into a messy scholar's office with piles of notes here and there and boxes of archaeological evidence, skeletal remains, etc., and trying to piece it together? Now, she didn't have all the wrong bones, but some of the key bones in her essay, we think now she had the wrong ones. And that's why we have this remarkable discrepancy. Whereas Haas described the skeleton of a young, tall man, a man he estimated to be in his mid-20s, who was both crucified and beheaded, Smith described the skeleton of a short, elderly woman. Well, it just didn't come together. And she wasn't certain of the evidence of the nails. The nails were no longer in situ, and so she looks at the nails, and because nails have been found in ossuaries and tombs, she just thought, well, so there's nothing special about these nails. Well, I read her article, and that's why I decided not to say anything about the evidence of the Abba tomb because of her work. Well, Yoel Elitzer has reconstructed the whole matter, and my grad student and I had the opportunity to talk it over with Dr. Hushkovitz, and we are convinced that there was a confusion in the skeletal evidence. And so what we probably do have, as Niku Haas all along said, was the Abba Cave contained the ossuary, a beautiful ornate ossuary, and the crucified and decapitated remains of Mattathiah Antigonus, son of Judah Aristobulus, the last Hasmonean ruler. So that really is a remarkable discovery. But we weren't finished. By the way, we were shown the nails in this particular case, but we were not permitted to photograph them. So that's why you're not seeing a photograph of them. But we did have some other nails and things to look at. And these are the nails that were found either in or next to, maybe one in and one out, or both in, we're not sure. Nails found in the Caiaphas ossuary bearing traces of human calcium. And I know it's with the sun coming in, it's hard to see, but there's some calcium that's very obvious right here. But among the other nails, some nails would have calcium ringing almost like a wedding band, ringing the rusted, corroded nail. And so how did that happen unless the nail had been for a long time embedded in human bone? And there's a close-up, and again, I can see it's not, there's just a little bit of light and washout, but it's right there in this curved iron nail. Have we found the nails of Jesus? The nails I just showed you? Could they be the very nails used in the crucifixion of Jesus? As it was mentioned, I'm from Acadia University in Nova Scotia, that's eastern Canada, so Canada is proud, and I'm saying that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of its naked archaeologist, Simka Jakubowicz. How many of you have heard of our nude archaeologist? Good. I guess it's good. About a third of you. Yeah, he brings out some kind of edgy archaeology sometimes. And anyway, he has argued the two nails I just showed you are from the Caiaphas ossuary are those used to crucify Jesus. Caiaphas retained them as a sort of trophy and eventually would be buried with them in his ossuary and crypt. Well, what can we say? There is no inscription, there's no identification tag, nothing that says these are the nails of Jesus. There's nothing that says these are not the nails of Jesus. So I have to admit it is theoretically possible, but I think you will agree it is the sheerest speculation. So I think that's all it is, and that's the end of the matter. I find it very unlikely that when Jesus was crucified, Caiaphas, through one of his servants, said, now be sure to get his nails. I want to hang on to them. Someday when I'm buried, I want them buried with me. I mean, I find that extremely unlikely. Now, we still have work to be done. The nails recovered from tombs and ossuaries need to be carefully studied. That was one of the disappointments that we learned in conversation with Dr. Hershkovitz, but also in reviewing Rachel Hachlili's work on evidences from tombs and burial. She has a section in her book on iron objects that have been recovered, and it's noted that a lot of this material, just the in situ evidence is not reviewed. It just, nobody took note. What Hershkovitz did, he sort of illustrated it. He said what happens is they would find an ossuary, archaeologists, and they'd carefully remove the bones, and because that obviously is very important. But then the nails, if there were any nails or coins or whatever at the bottom then of the ossuary, they were just poured out and got mingled in with the iron objects, coins, nails, whatever, that were outside of the ossuary on the floor or in a niche or wherever. And so records weren't kept. So future discoveries of nails need to take greater care to note more exact details of where the nails are found. And this is what Hershkovitz told us. Are the nails found on top of the bones? That would strengthen the argument that the nail perhaps was used for inscribing a name on the ossuary, and then it's pitched into the box, and then the lid is placed. Or were the nails somewhere down beneath the bones, within the bones, impacted in the bones, which could be evidence of crucifixion? In any case, that needs to be done. So, and of course that helps us then understand better how human calcium clings to the nails. Is it just perchance where a nail is simply resting against a human bone for hundreds of years, and as the nail then corrodes, it simply picks up calcium that leaches into the corrosion? Is that all it is? It's just an accidental contact? Or when we have calcium all the way around a nail, is it because it's actually impacted in a skeleton, and then as the skeleton begins to decompose and breaks apart, when the bones are then removed, the nail simply comes loose, and nobody notices how the nail, the in situ evidence is lost because it never occurred to anybody to pay attention to coins and nails. I mention coins because in one case, in the Caiaphas ossuary found at Peace Forest in 1990, I was initially skeptical that it was the Caiaphas ossuary, but after the discovery of the granddaughter, Miriam, and the fact that she's the granddaughter of Caiaphas the priest, that's pretty well answered my skepticism on that point. But there was another Miriam in the Caiaphas tomb, and a coin was actually glued to the roof of the mouth. And I think that went a long way to explaining the presence of coins in ossuaries. In other words, we're talking about obols for passage over the river Styx to pay the fare to Charon. Now, maybe not in every case, but we wondered, sometimes there was a correspondence, 3, 4, 5 skeletons in an ossuary, 3, 4, 5 coins in the box. What does that mean? Well, by finding a coin glued to the roof of the mouth of a skull, that would suggest that the coin had in fact been placed in the mouth according to that custom.